Okay, welcome everyone to our October 11th LibsWork meeting. I'm Andrea Lewandowski, the Library Consultant for Small Business Development and Technology at the New Jersey State Library. Today we are being joined by the team from Mount Auburn to talk about measures that matter. But before we get into that, for anyone who might be new joining us today, please introduce yourself in the chat. Everybody is putting in their names and their positions and where they work. And if you are interested in attending any other LibsWork meetings in the future, our next meeting will be November 8th. We meet the second Tuesday of the month. And that meeting will include Susan Priest from Topsham Public Library and Madeline Ildefonso from Los Angeles Public Library, and they're going to be talking about libraries build business. And on December 13th, Dr. Africa Hands is going to be talking about research, looking at rural unemployment and how to prepare prospective college students in regions of Appalachia for educational attainment. And I don't know that I'm explaining that well enough, but please come to those sessions to learn more. This group, we talk about workforce development and business development in libraries, and always looking for other people to come and discuss those topics as well. But we're really thrilled to be joined today by the Mount Auburn team and to learn more about the research that has recently been conducted. So Tim, I will turn it over to you to introduce the project and our speakers today.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And I'd like to thank the entire group for allowing time for this on your meeting today. I know that there's probably no shortage of topics that you could be spending your time on. So we're really pleased that we're here to talk a little bit about this research that has just come out. For those of you who may not be aware, Measures That Matter is an initiative that was brought forward by the chief officers of state library agencies in cooperation with the Institute of Museum and Library Services and with financial support from the Institution of Museum and Library Services. It's a multi-year project that has had a number of different phases to it. And there have been, over the last few years, I would say 4 major pieces of research coming out of Measures That Matter. You can see them all on the Measures That Matter website. I'll put the URL in chat in just a moment here. The previous research, the earlier research that was done, the first 3 pieces, looked at data collection and use generally, and that is really one of the focal points of Measures That Matter. It's looking at public library data collection and use. So the first 3 pieces of substantial research that came out were looking at that generally, there was an emphasis on survey instruments themselves and how effective they are and what they collected, what overlap may have been there. There was also a lot done on where are some of the gaps in data collection and use for public libraries, and some ideas flowing from the initiative about how the field might address those. The study that we released last week and that we're here to talk about today is the most focused in the sense that we're looking at a particular area, workforce development and small business development in this case. And this study originated at a time when some of you may have noticed that IMLS was helping the field to focus a little bit on issues around community well-being. So at the time, we talked with IMLS about what was happening in Measures of community well-being work, and it seemed like, well, this is an interesting intersection to bring together some work around data collection in one of the areas that has an impact on where libraries can have an impact or influence on community well-being. So we chose workforce development, which also includes small business support, and brought on the team from Mount Auburn to actually conduct this research. I think we're getting into the time period where we can stop saying this, but there were, of course, delays in this related to the pandemic. But those delays in some ways helped the study to focus a little bit. And it changed and morphed a little bit. And in fact, the study changed in ways that accounted for some of the things that we believe public libraries were facing as a result of the pandemic, and now as we're coming out of it. So that's all I'm going to say about measures that matter and how we got here today. I will put the website for the project in the chat in a moment. And I'll also mention that today's discussion is going to be pretty focused. I know that the Mount Auburn team is really pleased to be here with this particular group because of your focus. We will be doing later in October some more general webinars as well. So if you'd like to hear more, hear things again, there'll be another opportunity for you to join the team. And finally, I just want to thank this group for really the early engagement on this. I know at the time that Measures That Matter was underway, I was with the chief officers of state library agencies, and Lisa Shaw, who I believe is on here, and also Elizabeth Ayuka, who is on here. We're at state library. Well, Lisa's still at a state library. Elizabeth, I know you've moved over away from the state library, but really we turned to them very early on and knew about this group and knew about your interests and really appreciated that early engagement and participation along the way in both the advisory group. And for those of you who were study sites, just thank you for making the time for that, for the Mount Auburn team to come. We've really learned a lot about this. So at this point, I'm going to turn the conversation over to, I should note that we have Beth Siegel and Emily Dolio, and I think Kendra Lodewick is also with us today, although I'm not seeing her, from the Mount Auburn research team and PPI, and Emily Plowman from the Institute of Museum Library Services also with us. Emily was also instrumental in not only helping shepherd this through some of the processes that are necessary as a result of the federal connection to this research, but just bringing her expertise as a researcher to this as well. So at this point, I will turn Emily Dolio to you. Thank you.
Emily, are you on? Emily is having
trouble. I'm not sure if it's Emily Plagman, Beth?
no, Emily
Dolio.
Doglio, but I
Emily
think
Dolio.
she is having Zoom problems. So I will, can I share my screen?
Absolutely. Andrea,
Okay.
are you able to make her co-host?
I think she should be able to without
do
that.
it. Good. Okay, you should be able to just click the bottom.
Recording in progress.
Do you see it now?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Okay. So Tim gave a great introduction for us, and we were going to say a lot of the same things, which is we have been following this group, and it's been great to have a group that I felt was somewhat of an audience I've been reading, you probably don't realize it, but I have been reading and looking at some of your webinars, and it has informed our work. So it has been a two-way street. You have informed us, and hopefully we can start informing you. So in terms of the agenda, we want to start with talking about some of the research questions. And one of the things we did, which I think was a little different and which added some value to our work, is we have separated the idea of the actual services, which are the concrete programs and activities of the library. And number 3 is what we call the role of the library in the workforce and small business development systems. So we're thinking about the system role as well as the direct role. Then we'll talk a little bit about the outcome tracking and what we've learned from that and how we're building on the learning. So I won't spend a lot of time on the research questions because I think Tim covered the basics of it, but we're really trying to understand both what libraries have been doing to improve economic conditions, sort of what is the value add of libraries in this work, how are they contributing to business growth and skill development, and we also were looking at are there key hypotheses that we can identify that might require some further thinking. So in terms of, yes.
Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm here. Sorry, everyone. I'm having so much trouble. If you don't mind, Beth, could you go to slideshow and start presentation from this slide so it's a little bigger for everyone to see?
Yeah, but sometimes my
I know it's hard on Zoom.
Yeah, I will do that.
From current slide. Thank you, Beth.
Okay, hopefully that'll work. Great. Is that better for everyone? So there have been 3 phases of this work, and I think Tim alluded to this too. And we started with literature, or pretty comprehensive literature review, and we worked on a theory of change, which you'll see pieces of. And that was sort of the underlying sort of frame for the work. We created this frame for the work that we were going to be doing. And then we identified, chose, and completed the 10 case studies, and then completed a cross-site report, which looked at the 10 case studies, the findings and themes. So one thing that was interesting is sort of like, there are a lot of findings that are sort of not fundamental to the work, but sort of interesting in a way, which you might find interesting. One of the ways we started by selecting the universe of libraries was that through this literature review, we identified any library that had been cited as having done interesting work in the areas of business development and workforce. And we also had an advisory committee that provided some ideas and names of libraries that were possible. So out of that work, we ended up with around 85 libraries that we considered as the universe of ones that had something exemplary or influential. One of the little side developments, which is worth talking about at some point, is that often we found that some of the libraries that are noted in journals, it's very shallow, and that when you get into it, those case studies aren't really very exemplary or models or even very influential. They, for some reason, sometimes get cited a lot, and then the next study will cite them again. But it's sort of an extra little finding there. In terms of the case study research, we did them in person, which, as Tim noted, was one of the reasons why the project took a little longer. Every time we kept thinking we're going to be able to do them in person, we'd have to extend it for another 3 months. And we talked to about—
Sorry, Beth, we can't see the slide that you're on. It still says phases of the work. I'm not sure if you have to adjust the screen share to be the full screen.
It is, and I see methods.
I could try.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
It gets tricky with sharing slideshows.
Yeah.
Emily, do you need Beth to stop sharing in order to
I
share?
think so, yeah.
Hey, I stopped.
So we should be here.
Okay. Giving control over to Emily. She is better at this. So we interviewed about 8 to 15 individuals per site, and that included the branch staff, the system staff, but we also went out in the field and talked to stakeholders involved in workforce and business development, and then it also tried to get some general civic leaders. And then after we completed, as some of you may be seeing, these very intensive large case studies, we used the case studies and some other software for qualitative analysis to generate the cross-site themes. Next slide. So this is an overview of the libraries that we selected. And if you could see the next slide, the libraries we really sought to have a diverse set of libraries in terms of the size, the type, the organizational type, the number of branches, their rural versus urban. So we think that this is a pretty good geographic and diverse on a lot of other elements in terms of the case studies. So Emily, are you going to be able to do this section?
I'm going to try. If you can't hear me, you just alert me in the chat. I apologize again for the technical difficulties. I'll give an overview of the different types of services we see libraries offering related to workforce and small business development. This chart gives some examples. It's laid out using the framework that we developed as part of the theory of change process to categorize the different types of services into standard, specialized, and community hub. We see standard services as the almost universally accessible, available at all libraries, often unscheduled services offered by libraries. A lot of these have to do with access to technology, computers, Wi-Fi. They're more passive in their delivery. Patrons can just go into the library and use the computer. Also online services and librarian assistance. Specialized services are often a bit more hands-on and designed and delivered by the library, such as workshops or training, but they could also be designated space, like a career center or a maker space or co-working space for small business development. Community hub services we see as unique in that they are developed or delivered in partnership between the library and another organization. This often looks like another partner organization coming into the library to deliver a workshop or a training program, but could also look like on-site location of a career center at the library. We saw a couple examples of those across the case study sites, where the slides I will send out after, and then the full report as well as the case studies are available online. So yeah, the Career Center co-location is a model that we saw across a couple of the case studies where the workforce staff at the Career Center is delivering the services on site at the library. I'll walk through a couple examples using Memphis Public Library related to workforce services. The standard services, again, they're more like the online resources, like an online platform for job searching, also online training resources or access to technology. The specialized services in Memphis, they have a JobLink Career Center with specialists who work one-on-one with job seekers. That could look like interview prep or helping people fill out a resume. They also have a bus that they use to go across the city. It has laptops, it has staff on it that help folks do that same type of work without having to go directly to the library. And in terms of collaboration and community hub services, Memphis hosts career events such as job fairs in the library space in collaboration with the city of Memphis and other partners. They also have like employers or other partners come in with a table to give out information to patrons related to workforce development as well. Here are some examples using the Hartford Public Library case. Again, the standard services are mostly online resources or books related to business development, databases, or assistance from library staff. Specialized services in Hartford, they have an example, the Women's Entrepreneurship Program that they launched based on relationships they had with a group of female immigrants in the community who were selling goods from their own homes. They ended up securing a grant and were able to offer small business development workshops for those women in Spanish and also for other community members who were interested. And the grant also funded some money for childcare as well as materials for the workshops as well. And then in terms of community hub services, an example for small business development at Hartford includes SBA workshops on how to start a business, where the SBA comes into the library site to deliver workshops to patrons. Some key themes that we saw in terms of library services and workforce and small business development, we really see that standard services are a critical service that libraries offer to job seekers and entrepreneurs. Even just being able to go into the library to use a computer, to print something, to fill out a job application, those are hard to track, which is why they may be undermeasured and underappreciated, but they are a really key way that libraries are serving their communities. When we take a look at the types of specialized services that we saw across the case study sites, we saw that they tended to be leaning more towards workforce development than small business development programming in terms of like training and workshops. A lot of the small business specialized services that we found on the case study sites were more like maker spaces or other small business centers. And again, this is going to come across throughout the presentation, but we really see that digital literacy services, access to technology, as well as training or one-on-one assistance are one of the key services that libraries are providing related to workforce and small business development. I mentioned a little bit about the co-location of the Career Center. The library case studies had different models in the way that they were delivering that. But we found some evidence that the Career Center model may benefit from cross-staff training, collaboration, integration between the Career Center staff and the library staff. We also saw that for the case study sites, there tended to be a concentration, especially of the specialized and community hub services at the central branch of the library system, whereas the local branches tended to develop more ad hoc services for their community-specific needs. And lastly, I will say, of course, the libraries were affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, like everybody else. They had to close down. However, a lot of them were able to develop innovative ways to deliver resources and programming online or outside or in other ways that have allowed for new learning and new opportunities that are sticking around even in this new normal. I'm going to shift a little bit. Instead of focusing on just services, I'm going to talk about the role that we see libraries playing in their workforce and small business development systems. I'll try to go through this pretty quickly. This is a slide from the theory of change that we developed as phase 1 of this research. What I want to get across here is that we see libraries, both in the services and resources that they directly offer, as well as because of the relationships and partnerships they have with other organizations and the referrals they're able to make to those services and the other way around, that all of that in combination is contributing to systems that are more efficient and more inclusive, including by making it more accessible, by improving system alignment and coordination, and just making it all more efficient. Some examples of how we see those relationships looking between libraries and other organizations. Some of them are pretty informal, like librarians are aware of the other organizations in their community and the services that they offer, and the other way around. So both libraries and other community organizations are able to refer to each other to promote each other's events and services through promoting like flyers or brochures at their location. More formal partnerships often look like the other organization coming into the library space and delivering their resources or services, like a workshop or a training program offered by SCORE or the local workforce system. They can also look like a more formal partnership, like jointly designing or operating a training program or workshop together. Multi-stakeholder engagement is when we see the libraries more deeply engaging in their community's civic infrastructure, such as by convening other workforce or small business development entities to work towards a common goal. Or even just like participating in those events, not necessarily just convening, but just deeply engaging in their community's civic infrastructure. Here are some examples of those types of relationships across the case studies. The informal relationships are pretty self-explanatory. We saw some at Bangor and North Liberty, but really across the case studies where library staff are reaching out to other providers and facilitating cross referrals and just being knowledgeable about the services that are being offered at other organizations. For formal partnerships, the most common example that we saw was between the library system and the community's career center across the case studies. Some examples of where there's a co-location is Cambria County Library. They have a career link location at their main branch. And then in Kenton County, there's an access point for their career center at a library branch as well. For examples of multi-stakeholder engagement, Brooklyn Public Library really plays a convening role in their ecosystems. They bring together adult literacy organizations. And then Asotin Community Library took the lead in developing a broadband action team and also participates in a career development team with local organizations. This slide goes into a bit more detail about the system outcomes that I mentioned as part of our theory of change. So we see libraries as increasing the number of residents in the community who are receiving workforce or business development services. We really see them as serving as the system's front door. Libraries are accessible location. People know where the library is. Often it's in a downtown location. They're also seen as safe and welcoming spaces. They're trusted by the community. So people who might not be familiar with or feel comfortable going to a more traditional workforce or business development provider may already be at the library for another reason or may feel safe to go there to search for a job. Additionally, libraries provide crucial system navigation, both for workforce and business development, but also for critical social services that may be relevant to job seekers and entrepreneurs as well. They also increase the type of people who are reached by the workforce and business development system by addressing the needs of specific populations. For example, when I was talking about Hartford earlier, I mentioned they had relationships with female immigrants in the community and were able to respond to their needs by providing business development workshops in Spanish. We also see libraries as contributing to system efficiency. They are able to, because of the relationships that they have, they are aware of the services that are being provided by other organizations, which contributes to reducing service duplication and contributing to system alignment. It's also because of the types of services that they offer. Again, we see the access to technology and digital literacy services, also basic literacy and ESOL, as really critical for libraries. In order for community members to even engage with the traditional career center or SBA, they need to be able to use a computer, to use email, and to have a certain level of proficiency in these skills. So in this way, libraries are both uniquely well positioned to provide this service and filling a major gap in the system, a major need of their communities, and really contributing to system efficiency. We also see libraries as contributing to system efficiency by providing free access to a lot of different online workforce and small business training resources and data. We found in some of our interviews that traditional providers were stopping telling their clients to buy proprietary data because it's already available online for free at the library. I'll just summarize with some key themes of how we see libraries playing a role in their workforce and small business development systems. First, I cannot emphasize enough how expanding the reach of existing systems may be one of the more significant outcomes of public libraries and contributing to community economic well-being. We see libraries as increasing the number of people who are receiving these services and often excluded population groups as well. Additionally, it's really key that libraries are providing access to technology and services related to digital literacy as a way that contributes to filling a gap in the system and responding to a huge need in many communities as well. In terms of the types of relationships, we see that public libraries that develop deep multi-stakeholder engagement may be able to contribute to greater system-related outcomes because they have an understanding of the resources that the library can provide to the community, and the organizations have that as well. And lastly, we found that the libraries who had a culture of collaboration and dynamic, proactive leadership were able to integrate libraries into their community. And I'm gonna pass the mic to Beth to talk about tracking and measurement.
Great, Emily. So as Tim mentioned, really one of the key elements of this project was really coming out of Measures That Matter in terms of thinking about how libraries measure the outcomes of their work and what can we learn from this pilot project about workforce that might be relevant to other areas where the libraries are doing work. So as part of our theory of change, we kind of stepped back and said, what are the types of outcomes that libraries can conceivably be achieving in terms of their community? And again, use this theory of change as a frame to think about measurement. And we looked at some of the direct individual outcomes, outcomes on employer, and again, the system outcomes that could lead to community outcomes. So I think one of the real takeaways from the work we have done is that there's a lot of expectations about what libraries are supposed to be doing or could ideally do around measurement, but that in the end, it's a very difficult area. And that we found that most case study libraries were very good at collecting the general library measures that are required by the state, federally and by their states. There is some effort to track the online databases that they use. The libraries have been better at what we call tracking outputs, and by that we mean the libraries are more likely to say how many people came to a workshop, which is really an output. The outcome would be how that workshop affected their either career development or small business starting, but that the focus has been on outputs, and that a lot of libraries informally collect anecdotal evidence of program impact. So this anecdotal, the stories are sort of an informal way that libraries and their staff are collecting information about the work they're doing. In terms of the rarer type of measurement that we saw, were information requests. So we didn't find many cases, but there were a few cases where for example, the reference librarians were actually tracking what kind of assistance they were providing to folks related to workforce development and business development. More likely, the reference libraries were using paper tallying to say, how many requests they got for a certain day, or who they referred, not who they referred, but what kind of questions they were getting, but not very specific to workforce and business development. There's only one case study library that was tracking the actual referrals, and that is an area we'll speak about a little more. And there were a few examples of libraries, most notably in Brooklyn, where there was a pretty sophisticated effort to actually look at the outcomes. So they were not only saying how many people attended their program for high school equivalency, they were actually saying how many people actually got a high school equivalency exam after participating in the program, which is more of an outcome. So again, Brooklyn is interesting, but we have to remember that Brooklyn is one of the largest systems in the entire country. But Brooklyn actually has 2 full-time staff that is in charge of data collection. They do a lot of general library metrics. Through that staff, they really are working on how do we visualize the data. So it's not only collecting the required data, but working with the other staff to say, how can we make this data meaningful so that branch managers and other library staff will find that data meaningful. They also have software which is able to categorize email and chat references. They track how many patrons have accessed online resources, and they're very good at tracking program outputs. But like I noted, where they're sort of unique is that they really do track program outcomes. Most of the work around program outcomes are related to a funder who is requiring them to do that. But in some cases, for example, in their Power Up, which is a small business contests for entrepreneurs, they go back years later and really do surveys to follow up what happened to the entrepreneurs that participated in the program. They are also very good at reporting and looking at anecdotal advice. So Brooklyn is a good example of a library that has looked at all and are using all of these different types of measurements. Next slide. But as you well know, there are a lot of challenges to measurement. And I think this is one of the biggest aha moments for us, not coming from the library universe, was the degree to which libraries present a very unique case about data collection and outcome measurement. That we know how hard it is to do in the workforce development system and the small business development system, but there are challenges in libraries in addition to that. So one is just the issue of staff capacity. I remember even just in one of the libraries I visited, they were talking about the reference staff, and they said the reference staff doesn't have the time even to go online, provide help to a patron who walks in, and then track what they're doing while another patron is waiting for assistance. So that's just one example of where this capacity came up many times. Most importantly, and I don't have to go into this in detail for you because you all know it, is the commitment to patron privacy. We heard it over and over again at the libraries that collecting personally identifiable information is a real concern, and that the librarians really believe that one of the unique value adds that they have in the overall system is they are not asking a lot of questions. Third is this question of attribution, that libraries do play a role in the system, but it would be very hard to make a clear correlation between the specific assistance provided by the library and the outcome that was created. So sometimes people will say, oh, why aren't you looking at a decrease in the unemployment rate, or things like, or the number of new businesses created? But of course, the library is just part of a broader system, and you can't really attribute any of those changes to the library. And the librarians involved in this work know that. We also found, and this is true in practically every system we work in, is that the actual technology systems do not work, and that many libraries have multiple different systems that they're working in, or their funders have different data systems that they are working in. So it's been really difficult to collect all the data in one system and use it. And patron mobility and limited engagement in library programs also makes it very difficult to do follow-up data collection. So I use the example in Brooklyn of Power Up, and they talked about that. They really had all the best intentions, but actually finding some of these entrepreneurs 2 and 3 years later was no easy task. So a lot of challenges in this work. And because of all these challenges, we realized that no library is going to try to overcome any of the challenges unless there's a real motivation to do so. And we looked at 3 different types of motivations. So first, as I mentioned in Brooklyn, there are funder requirements. If you are getting a grant through the federal workforce system, there are requirements for reporting outputs and outcomes that you're going to have to participate in. And that is a real incentive to do the outcome tracking. On the left side, internally, we found that the strongest motivation is when the motivation is coming internally with a recognition of learning, that we're going to track these outcomes or outputs, and we're going to look at the data because we want to do a better job. We want to be more effective at what we're doing. We want to better understand community needs. We want to better apply the resources and programming at our library. So that internal kind of culture of learning is a really strong motivation. And the middle case is the one that we often think about, that data is to make the data and tracking is needed to make the case. It's presenting the value of the library to municipal, county, and state officials, communicating the public value and the value of partnerships. So that is another motivation, but it's unrealistic. What our finding was in the end is it pretty unrealistic to think that most public libraries are going to be able to complete a rigorous analysis of outcomes, unless, again, if they have an outside funder that motivates them. But outside of that, it's very unrealistic, we think, for libraries to be expected to be tracking the outcomes. Again, they need a compelling motivation to engage in the activity. And as part of that, it's clear that we talk about data collection and measurement as if it's one thing, but it's really going to look differently depending upon the audience and the purpose of the data collection. As I noted, creating a culture of learning and having a strong champion on the staff for using data for learning is probably one of the most important factors in terms of doing this work. And again, we saw it at various libraries we visited where, again, data was, how can we improve our own practice? And then there's a strong motivation. And again, being realistic, there is a need for specialized staff and data systems if there is going to be a hope that libraries are going to be tracking outcomes in any more rigorous way. So that's a lot, and we're going to end soon so we can have the discussion, but we want to just kind of step back a little and say, what are the big takeaways that we had from doing this work? And the first is relationships, relationships, relationships. We started our work thinking that it was all about programs, programs, programs. And we stepped away and said, you know what? The libraries that have developed really good relationships with the other service providers and civic organizations are the ones that are really maximizing kind of the workforce impacts and the small business impacts. They mitigate the risk of replicating services. It's possible, it's more likely that you're aligning the work across the different institutions. And when relationships are really strong, that's when the community sees the importance of the library. So you don't have to make the case to a workforce service provider or a small business service provider about how important the libraries are. They know it because they're working with them, and they carry that message in the broader community. So relationships are critically important. As Emily said very early on, this whole idea of standard services is also very important. Every library provides some level of standard services. So you don't have to have a special, how to do an interview program or how to start a new business program to have an impact on the system. Just having those services and having librarians who are naturally trying to help their patrons is a critical impact on the system. I'm not going to, we've said it so many times, but we really came down, and digital literacy was probably the greatest value add that libraries had in these two systems. And that libraries who see their facilities themselves as key community assets are really making a big difference in their community. So it's not just the services we provide, but we have these spaces that we are offering more broadly to other community organizations to create efficiencies and to create collaborations in our community, creating a more collaborative environment overall. And our last point in terms of our big takeaways was that nobody's measuring or thinking about these system impacts, and we are thinking more and more that it's one thing to measure the outcomes of a specific program. It's another thing to understand the networks and relationships and ways in which a library is having this more system-wide impact in the community. We saw that there are also ways to think about overcoming some of the challenges that we noted in outcome measurement, perhaps developing some more systematic approaches to presenting data on service utilization and feedback, using really creative approaches to address privacy concerns like double-blind coding, amalgamated profiles. I mean, there are libraries and librarians we met with who did see that while privacy is a key challenge, there may be creative ways to overcome them. Developing specialized instruments to track patron use of standard services. So when we started this project, we had this idea of, is it possible to have, when you walk into the library, some sort of software where the minute you log on, there's an effort to see if you're getting workforce development services or looking for a job. And we've been toying with, is there a pilot effort to develop software or work on something like that? Tracking referrals by library staff and other service providers, we think that is one of the ones which it would be the easiest to develop some pilot efforts at some libraries to really do that in a more systematic way. And then in terms of the hub services, is there a more deliberate way to work with partners to capture, a lot of them are capturing the data and making sure the library has access or working with those partners to track data. In terms of tracking system improvements, I mentioned tracking referrals, tracking online training programs and skills through these programs. So a lot of librarians track like how many people are accessing certain of their online databases. But while I think the data is available, very few will say, 200 people went on to access this online database, and 4 people actually received a high school diploma or got a certification or credential when they participated in this program. And again, as I mentioned, tracking the number of patrons who are using the computers for workforce and business development activities. So there are a lot of other ideas when you see the full report about ideas of the hypotheses to further explore, pilots to further explore some of these ideas. So this is just the beginning. So now we open it for a discussion, and hopefully that has whetted your appetite for for sharing some of this learning.
Beth and Emily, thank you so much for all you did on this. It was great to hear it all nicely wrapped up in a bow after participating. So what kind of questions do we have out there this afternoon? Not seeing anybody with.
It looks like Brandy. Hi.
Everybody, how are you today? I am curious about, I'm looking for the button to lower my hand. I'm curious about when you talked about the standard services, the specialized services, and then the community hub services. Would you consider that a progression of, basic to good to better to best? Or are they building on each other? Are they all tied together? I guess the question is, should we be aspiring to the hub services?
That's an interesting question. I would say the best done standard services are probably better than poorly done specialized services. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I think it's sort of being good in all three of those categories is what I would say, because again, libraries who are really strong in the standard services get underappreciated for the work that they're actually doing as just part of their normal day-to-day work. And that does require.
It depends on the size of the library too. For some of the smaller branch staff that we interviewed, for them to really do their own specialized services is just beyond like what's realistic for their library capacity. But they can partner with other organizations, and they're already doing the standard services. So I'm not necessarily sure if it's a progression, but a system that is able to do all three, I think is for the best.
And being one of them, Brandy, I would say you can't make it to the point of being a hub or a community center unless you've done the other two.
Mm-hmm. Thanks all.
Anyone else?
I have a question. The case studies, did you find that these services were the result of the entire library sort of prioritizing these services? Or was it one person's passion that led to things? So was it like a coordinated effort for the most part, or did it seem like it was a person who was able to make these connections and that person themselves was the most critical?
Another really good question. So you're making us think even further, as much as we've thought about it, these are good questions. And I'll say something and then see what Emily has to say. I think it's a lot about the passion of individuals. I'll use the Bangor libraries. They hired a new person in one of their reference librarian roles. And that role in the past didn't involve going out and setting up meetings with all the workforce service providers. But this librarian felt that was critical to her job, and she became passionate about doing it. Or the folks that are involved in Brooklyn in the Power Up, So I'd say that. At the same time, there is a leadership culture of innovation and a leadership culture of serving the community that I think has to be there. You know what I mean? So I don't think one rogue person can go out and do this unless there was a supportive leadership behind that thought this was important.
Yeah, I agree. I think especially on the workforce side, it does feel so like innate to what many libraries are already doing. I mean, libraries and librarians help patrons get the information that they need. And so many people are job seekers or are looking for other like related information. So on the workforce side, it felt like it didn't necessarily need to come from the top. It was just such a common community need. On the small business side, sometimes it was the case that there was like a funder who had the idea to do a business center. There was more like one person leading that. But in terms of the types of relationships, particularly those that make the referrals more effective and lead to more community hub services, that is reliant on like the type of leadership that integrates the library with the community, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, it made me think when you said that of the Bangor story, because Bangor, when we first contacted them, said very directly, because they had a business center that we thought was, oh, really innovative. You know, it's like this co-working space for for their community. And very early on, they said, we'll agree to do this, but we want to do it as a cautionary tale. Again, not as a best practice. And basically said that there was such a rush to play this role in the community that they didn't do sufficient due diligence about whether that was an appropriate role for the library to do it. So sometimes just having one person go off and say, oh, this is a priority and we're going to do it, might not lead to the best outcomes.
And then Beth, we have another great question in the chat. I think that you'll likely want to answer. Lori asked, why did you choose to look at workforce development and small business development bundled together? Because of the economic impact or job creation?
So that was a very big question early in our project, and it was related to the literature review that we found that others often bundled the two together. And in workforce development, it was increasingly a sense that helping entrepreneurs develop their own jobs is actually part of the workforce development system. And that a lot of times when we were doing the initial interviews as part of the theory of change, some of the people we were speaking to were covering both at their library. So like, for example, in Brooklyn has a jobs as, you know, a business and career center, you know, so they're often bundled together. So that was the primary reason that we thought while we are doing this, it's the boundaries are kind of fuzzy. So let's do them both, think about them separately, but include them both.
I can add an example for that as well, Beth, that when COVID hit and so many people had lost jobs, in our job support group that we led, what happened is many people were able to get contract roles with companies to get hired for 90-day contracts, those types of jobs that eventually, after time, when things started to get better, they were hired on as full-time employees. So what we did is we started offering classes to start your own consulting business, start your own business, and those became a staple. So we offer those quarterly. So that's something that stemmed out of it, that combined workforce with small businesses. Anybody else?
Thank you. There's one more in the chat. Emily Goodman asked, did any of the libraries talk about what kind of supports they needed or wanted along the way?
So I think this issue of staff capacity, particularly when it comes to measurement, I think that was an area that there was a lot of interest in terms of needs. And I think a lot of times libraries were piloting and experimenting with new programs and new ways of doing things. And we're hoping that the state or other philanthropic resources would come in to like sustain a program that they were actually experimenting with. But it was clear that different systems had different access to philanthropic resources. Like, you know, in some areas there are big library foundations that could actually support that kind of innovation. In other places, there really weren't. So I think just staff capacity became the big ask, and sustaining work that they had innovated.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't have anything to add aside from just when we saw people saying they needed more support or capacity, it was largely related to the discussion of measurement, where they just like they didn't have the time, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the staff to do more rigorous tracking or measurement. Next question in the chat is from Mark. He asked, were libraries also engaging in wraparound support such as childcare, transportation, etc. at the same time?
Well, I think you mentioned that one case in Hartford, and I think the case in Memphis where they actually came to folks, but I didn't see it in my sites. I'm wondering.
Yeah, I think that's a function of our interview protocol, where we were like really heavily focused on workforce and small business, and our definitions of those didn't necessarily include some of the more social services. We definitely saw examples where even in just like referrals that libraries are referring folks to, where they can get housing services or transportation services, but it's not something that we looked at in our interview protocol specifically. In Memphis, their 211 is located at the library. So for this study, the focus was on how job seekers could be calling 211 and getting job support services, but they are also able to support folks in relation to COVID and social services, and that's located at their library system.
Trying to read the questions.
And then in Cambria County, they had they were developing like a new floor of their central branch, where they were trying to like integrate adult space and child space. So if a parent wanted to come in and do a job interview using their Zoom services, that there would be safe places for their child to be in the library under supervision as well. I don't know if they were going to offer services, but at least space where it would be the kids not running into the street, and it's safe to be able to do both at the same time.
So there's a question about, when looking at the referral process, did you see a lot of commonalities, how these relationships looked across different library systems? I think there was a lot of variation in how those that referral process looked, and how formal versus informal. Like in some libraries, there was more of a soft handoff, where there was actually a more deliberate effort to, this person needs this help and I'll contact the organization and make the connection, versus the referral being, oh, you should go across the street, there's a career center over there. I think it varied a lot. Were there unique partnerships? Again, I think the Brooklyn work around adult literacy is really interesting, and they're running adult literacy programs in conjunction with some community partners. I think was a little bit more deliberate and a little bit more innovative than a lot of the other. But again, there's such a big system, it's hard to, when you're dealing with a one unit system like Bangor, and try to think about Brooklyn, there's just apples and oranges.
Yeah, there definitely was a large range, and I was just floating through my head like initial hypotheses, like maybe it's a smaller system that looks like this, or a larger system that looks like this, but I don't think that's true across the case studies that we chose. I think in the terms of the types of relationships that we laid out, the multi-stakeholder engagement enables both really strong referrals, where they're giving more of a warm handoff rather than just, oh, go to this agency. And also it helps libraries able to collaborate and convene with other organizations in their community, I think in a fuller way than with the more kind of passive, informal relationships.
But we've actually disproved we had some hypotheses that were disproved. So the hypothesis I would have had is that in smaller communities, the libraries are a much more obvious player, and it would be much more obvious for the library to be involved in all the civic organizations and civic activities in the community. And yet again, I hate to keep talking about Brooklyn, but they are but when it came to the small business system, they were a convener of a lot of the small business systems, really well known in the small business system, and same thing in the workforce system. So that kind of said, oh, you don't have to be a small community to develop that kind of role. You can also be an incredibly large city and still play a strong role in terms of your cross-stakeholder, cross-sector engagement, which surprised me.
Next question in the chat from Kathy. She asked, from the side of patrons, do you see a large enough number of patrons using or taking advantage of these services? Like all workforce and small business development services, Kathy, or did I miss a previous message? And large enough to do what?
Not sure if Kathy is still in the meeting.
Yeah, I don't see.
Oh, okay.
Well, this is one of the questions why we had this idea is we can't answer. It's funny, when we went into this work, we thought we were going to answer some of these questions and we were going to say in this system, they serve 862 people with workforce services this year. And this system we didn't get that data, and we didn't get that data because the libraries themselves don't know how large it is, the population of patrons who walked in during COVID, got on your computer, and were able, because of that, to apply for unemployment insurance or to get small business, one of the small business grants, or we have no idea. So I guess the question is, we don't know if it's a large enough number of patrons, and that's one of the problems. Our hypothesis is that it's unmeasured and unappreciated part of the library's role.
Beth, I can mention one unique thing that we're doing because we have had a success rate with people in our job search support group of over 550 people landing jobs. Our library has hired the economic development group at one of our local universities, and they're studying the impact of all those people coming back into the workforce, plus all the number of people attending the programs, eating lunch, buying houses here, paying taxes, all those kinds of things. In the university's budget offices has sophisticated software where they'll go in and measure and do like an impact study for you. So that's down the line after you've been involved for a lot of years.
Right,
so.
right. I think we mentioned that in the case study. I'm pretty sure Kendra mentions that. Yeah.
Okay.
But anyway, it is, that is, having partners who can be tracking along with you, like universities or other partners, is also
makes a difference.
Yeah.
Good.
So in New Jersey, we recently did a digital literacy and adult literacy project where it was modeled after a library that had very strong or has very strong workforce development partnerships, and they've been tracking using the WIOA forms and everything for probably like a decade. So they, in leading this project, they were telling other libraries, like, this is how we do it, this is how you should do it. And there was so much pushback on the privacy issues, and everything you were saying were things that came up. And so that's explaining my comment in the chat, that it's good to know it wasn't just this project, and that, it may not necessarily be a shortcoming of libraries, that if this is sort of across the board,
right,
and our metrics just need to be a little bit different, and the value that we the value that we're trying to communicate might just have to be explained in a different way. But there was even pushback in, well, when they came up with the form, any of the questions that weren't required, the librarians decided not to fill those in. So they didn't get as robust demographic and socioeconomic data. But now I'm like understanding a little bit more why. So this has been very interesting. And as we look forward to what we're going to do next, this is kind of like the lay of the land. And then what can we do to address this if we need to do anything? So thank you.
Right. I mean, in some ways, the privacy is one of the value adds. Because of the privacy is why, why patrons walk in sometimes to the library instead of going to the career center, So if you take that away, it's like your role in the system, which is the major value add you have, is going to be affected. So anyway, it was a real aha for us when we realized that.
Yeah, it's definitely true that the types of measures may be different, and then also the methods for measuring as well. That we found over and over again how important storytelling is for libraries to demonstrate their impact. And it didn't seem like privacy was such a barrier in that way. If folks were already coming in or sending an email or submitting a chat to say, this changed my life in this way, and then the library staff could just say, do you have permission to share this story? That it's an effective way, it's really compelling, and also perhaps gets around the privacy concern a bit.
So we do. When we post our celebration stories on our website, we only do it on LinkedIn for professional level people, but we always ask their permission to appear in our newsletter, on LinkedIn, all of that. And most people always say yes. Rarely do they not. One measurement you might not think of that we're using besides the anecdotal stories and things like that in the press that we get is we now have, when people want to make a donation to the library, they have the opportunity to earmark it towards workforce. And we're getting an amazing amount of donations from people who have landed jobs through the program. So that's another little anecdotal way that people ask, because people often will send, I have like stacks and stacks of thank you notes from people that we've received, but they always say, how can we help? What can we do? And we're like, oh, check things out. Come to the programs, you know, do those. But if you want to make a donation, you can earmark workforce. So we let people know about that. So anybody else?
There was a question about measuring the type of jobs. And I guess the answer to that is we haven't found good examples of them measuring the jobs. So it's hard to say the type of job. So in workforce development programs, there's a matching with the state. There could be a matching with the state wage records, at which point you would know what kind of job it was. But absent that, even in the workforce system, it's not a very not very easy to not only say, did someone get a job, but what was the specific job? And more importantly than that, how long did they actually stay in that job? Like, were they retained to that job 6 months later, 9 months later? So those are all outcome measurement challenges in the workforce system. And again, these are challenging for the workforce system. So when we step back and say libraries don't have the same incentives or capacity to deal with those challenges.
Anybody else? Any other questions?
Elizabeth brought up the issue of we've heard this a number of times on these calls, is are you as librarians overplaying the privacy issue? And that is something you might want to think about, because I don't know if anyone has done a real survey of it, but on other calls, people have also questioned whether it's not as big a challenge as librarians sometimes think it is.
I have to say it's easier if you have divide groups, or if you do something like a professional networking group, since networking is commonly known as the #1 way for professional people to land jobs, they're much less concerned about privacy because they need to meet people. But to your point, it only takes one person to complain about something to get everybody all worked up. So definitely an issue.
I feel like it may be like oversimplifying privacy a little bit as well, because there's so many different types of privacy. Like the example I was just talking about in the chat with Arlene, I was talking to some library staff who said that when patrons come in to get job search services, they don't have to say, oh, how many kids do you have and what's your address? Like, that's really personal information. Just sharing like your name or the types of services you want may also be like collecting some personal information, but not like that degree. So I think there may be a range, and protecting all of the information perhaps may be unnecessary for patrons.
Anybody else? Great. Well, it was wonderful. I don't think there are any other questions in the chat, Emily and Beth. So this was wonderful to have you both here and to see all the incredible amount of work you put into the study. How long did it take to complete the study?
Well, there was a lot of pre-work, but we really didn't start the case studies till February of this year, I think, Emily, right?
The first one was in March, I believe.
So there was a lot of pre-work to get to the point where we were able to identify the case studies, schedule the interviews, do the case studies, and then do the cross-site report. But that was all done more like in 8 months.
So a lot of work, but that was great. I just want to, Mark brought up a really good point. Would we be recreating the stigma attached to going to an American Job Center by collecting info? That could
That
be
was
a
one of the
worry.
yeah, that's one of the arguments folks use, is that people will do not like to give out that level of information. And plus there's a shaming. It's like when you walk into the library, people don't know why you're walking into the library, but when you go to the Career Center, everyone knows why you're going to the Career Center. So we don't know this rigorously. We only know what people have told us, but that in itself would have to be another study. How seriously, what do patrons really think?
Very true. Good. Andrea mentions, Emily and Beth, where else are you presenting this information, and can we share your presentation with our networks?
Tim may have a better response to that. I believe there's besides there's one like in a couple minutes where you wouldn't be able to share with everyone, but there's another one next week or later in the month.
Okay.
Yeah, there are two webinars late month, and they are just about to be announced, or maybe were just announced in the last day. Andrea, if I send that, we should forward that. Maybe you could forward it to the whole group.
Yeah, definitely.
You need me to, I can forward it to you if you haven't already, if you don't have to have it still.
Yeah, if you could send it, that would be great.
Okay, I'll send it to you after this conversation.
Thank you.
We also heard in a podcast yesterday that I think there's a stat out there that 18% of public libraries across the country have workforce librarians. And this study was going to be used to kind of encourage public libraries to get more into workforce. Do you know, Tim, are they going to do any kind of press release on the report and share it across the country or anything?
There was a press release on it, and it has been circulated actually to the kind of through usual library channels, but also to other organizations. I'm not sure about the effort that you're referring to, or actually that stat. That's an interesting stat. What was the source of that?
I believe my director presented at an OCLC function in Toledo 2 weeks ago, and he heard that, but then Lara Clark mentioned it in a podcast yesterday that I did with her yesterday. So I'm not sure. Okay, because we were wondering, we were one of the 10 libraries, but we haven't seen the press release. So we were wondering who was getting it. So good to know. Okay.
Well, that's a good point, Tim. Maybe each of this case study sites would want to see the press release, because they might say we were in this study. You know what I mean?
Right, and then reuse it. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do have the contact list for that. So I'll send that release out to folks. And actually, yeah, Lara's been, and she was on the advisory committee for this. I'll ask her about that stat, because that's highly interesting. I think it's higher than I would have guessed, to be honest with you. Even if it doesn't feel high, it's higher than I might have guessed.
It's higher than I would guess in terms of it's how they're defining a workforce staff person. You know what I mean? It's sort of the way you set the fact that many libraries are doing something about workforce development doesn't surprise me. The way you said it was that they actually have a specialized staff person. And since we didn't find in our 10 case studies many examples of specialized staff people, it sort of surprises me that a third of libraries,
It is interesting too, because some of us, Tammy Westergaard, who works on Project Sandy in the state of Nevada, she was very big on us starting to push to become certified workforce development professionals as librarians. So she is one, and I just completed that certification as well. But when I did it, what I immediately realized after I took the 2-hour test, that I barely passed it. And I've been working in this for like 10 years. It requires very in-depth knowledge of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. However, it gives us an opportunity to have other staff that maybe don't have a librarian rank that are joining us from the business community to get that certification to build their technical chops, if you will. So
as we said, relationships, relationships, relationships. And as you, in each of our case studies, we wrote a section on the context, which is who are the actors at the state and local level involved in workforce and small business development. My guess is that there are a lot of, that in itself was news to a lot of even the libraries we did the case studies of. You know, it's like, it's one thing to say build relationships. Sometimes they don't even know who to build relationships with.
Right. Good. All right. Alta Porterfield, that's a good question, Alta. How do you define workforce librarian? We in Kentucky, we define that as Hillary Britt, who's on the call.
We have 2 workforce librarians in Kentucky, technically. So Natalie Rupert's one of them, and then Lori Davis she's a workforce development manager in the Lexington Public Library in Central Kentucky. And my position is fairly new too. I think it became in 2017, 2018. So, and then I've been with the Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives since 2021. So, yeah, it's a relatively new field, but I'm interested about was it 13%? Did you say
18%?
18%. Yeah, I'm interested to learn more about that too.
I'll have to reach out.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Well, I was just interested because Delaware has been working, and I know a lot of states have been working for a very long time with workforce and the business piece, and then eventually we added the social determinants of health with the education, on and on and on. But all of us that were hired for this particular field are not librarians, so we don't identify as being librarians because our whole focus is the outreach, networking with the partners, and also with the jobs piece, right? The jobs or our behavioral mental health people and all that. So we would never say we're workforce librarians. We work on the workforce team, and our team is called social innovation. So that's bringing all of it in together, because when we're working with people, we need to be able to work on all the things that are barriers. And there's multiple barriers. We are, Natalie mentioned that, childcare, transportation, housing, but it goes beyond all that too. So so that helps us with getting more and more partners in. So it's the one thing about data and information is it's just on how you tweak it and what you define with it, and then how people see the question and how they understand the question to be able to answer in the way. So it's always interesting with surveys and all.
Yeah. That's a good point. There's a distinction between, does the library or the library state system have a workforce development specialist or someone who understands the workforce, and the degree to which the librarians at the libraries have an understanding of the workforce system. Those are 2 different things.
So I am with the state system. Right. So then we run the different things within all the libraries, because we're so small, and everyone's heard this a million times. Delaware is so small and so connected, and we know each other. I mean, it's like we always talk about jokes about, they're constantly seeing each other. So it makes it very simple for us to do this and all. And it's also easier for us because we deal with a lot of very personal information with people that don't seem to have any problems with sharing all this information, where a lot of times librarians would be a little concerned about hearing the information, let alone working with the information. We don't write it down per se, but we're hearing it, and we're not we just kind of run a different way. But we're not measuring things as well as we should at all. We're like the worst in measuring. Good on the outcomes, but nobody would know.
And there's so much tension between the statewide and the local, because the statewide partnerships can lead to a certain outcome, but it's dependent on the local entities, the local libraries or the local one-stops, to actually carry things out. So years ago, we had a program where there was supposed to be this referral system between libraries and the one-stops, but it required trust at the local level in order for the libraries to make proper referrals and for the one-stops to make referrals back. So it's hard to be everywhere to control everything. At some point, everybody has to be on the same page and prioritize the same types of relationships in order for it to work.
Relationships.
Yes.
Right?
But I think it also makes it easy again for us because we're hiring the people to go into the library. So it's not the staff that's doing it. It's actually us that are doing it for the libraries. And they're very happy for us to be in there because they don't have the manpower to be able to do it. So it just makes it simpler for that. So therefore the different one stops and all know us because we're doing the we're physically involved in it all the time, because if that's your only, it's always nice to be able to be super focused in an area, so then you're not spread too thin. So that's something too, that of course that's a joke because we're spread too thin, but anyways. Don't tell.
One last thing, and some of it is in the report and in the case studies, but we really did try to look at the support provided by both the state library system and the workforce system. And it really varies so much by state, where some of the states really, have a specialist who's focusing on that, or, have a special grant program focusing on it. And then other states, they provide online resources, but not much beyond that. So that's another kind of hypothesis in thinking, what is the role of the state library systems in terms of supporting this work? We just touched that issue. We didn't get deeply into it.
That is hard, and it makes such a difference on the size of your library system and where it's located and what's going on in your community. So I still think anybody that's getting into workforce in their area, they need to start small, and they really need to take time to interview their community partners, see where their gaps are and what would be good for the library to do that they can manage. We have a huge relationship with our American Job Center, our one-stop, as Andrea calls it, but like one of the libraries in the county south of us is a way smaller system. And the Career Center, as opposed to what they did with us, they just gave them this really cool kiosk with all kinds of resources. Plus they got maybe 5-10 laptops that they identified as workforce laptops that people can check out with a hotspot to look for jobs for 2 weeks. So they're just starting out at a smaller scale, but at least they're doing something, as opposed to what we do. So it just really depends on where you're located and resources, and massive difference between the big cities and the smaller communities. So anything else, since we're getting near the end today? Okay, so I guess we're at the end. I think, Tim, thank you for putting the links in the chat to the Measures That Matter reports. That was wonderful. Appreciate you sending that press release out to the 10 libraries. Again, we thank you. Emily, thanks for all your work, and Beth for yours. Andrea, you have our next meeting date on the calendar. That is going to be November 8th, as you mentioned, with Libraries Build Business. So we hope you can all join for that. And we just another push to remind you to join the LibsWork LinkedIn group on LinkedIn as well. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.